So good evening, everyone. This is the first in the series of three housing uh, s- little presentations we're going to have. We did the same thing last November and people really enjoyed it. And we are the City of Fredericton's Affordable Housing Committee. And I am on the City of Fredericton's Affordable Housing Committee, but my full-time job is as Executive Director of Greater Fredericton Social Innovation, which is a local charity. And also my co-presenter tonight is Janet Flowers. She's the City of Fredericton's Affordable Housing uh, Coordinator. I just guessed on that, Jen. I'm not absolutely sure that's her title. We are going to record tonight's meeting and shut down the recording when we open the Q&A. And I will post it on our YouTube channel and send everyone the link within the next few days. So I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we operate on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Willistok, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy's peoples. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which these nations first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Willistok title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We are all treaty people and we have a responsibility to each other and this land. We also recognize that land acknowledgements are one small part of disrupting and dismantling colonial structures and should be used to start conversations and bridge awareness into action. It is our responsibility to listen, learn, and actively contribute to a future where the rights, cultures, and aspirations of Indigenous peoples are honored and celebrated. Okay, Janet, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, so to share my screen, do I hit this little green button that says share?
Actually, I have your
Okay,
presentation. So you just say next slide and I got
okay,
you.
that'll be much better. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to come and talk again this year. We can go, it's actually Affordable Housing Development Coordinator. It's a big, long title, but it was good for what we have there. So I wanted to start with just a little bit of background so people get a sense of where the city's housing programs fit across this a continuum or a spectrum. And first of all, this spectrum isn't meant to assume that if there's an individual living at homelessness, that you're going to end up as any individual end up in a market house. It's not a straight line. It's just meant to illustrate the various types of housing from one end to the other. So there's homelessness, emergency shelters, transitional housing, which tends to be a bit longer, from 6 months to 2 to 3 years, and then supportive housing, often for people, individuals dealing with mental health and addictions or other requirements. And so the support is within the housing. And then there's community housing. And within this is not housing run by nonprofits and by housing cooperatives, and public housing that the province of New Brunswick manages as well. When you see the term affordable housing, which is a really loaded term, um, it's really talking about housing that's below market price. It doesn't necessarily mean people just paying 30% of their income. Generally, you would find that more in the community housing box. And then on the far right is market housing, both ownership and rental. So the programs that the city has go in the two below market ones, community housing and affordable housing. That's where we're trying to work. So what are the challenges we have? Go to the next slide there, Sandy. So affordability, what does it mean? It means something different to everybody. Our private sector developers really lack extra incentive to provide affordable housing. We have new needs in our housing. We need bigger units. A lot of the new apartments are being built 1 and 2 bedrooms, which don't meet family size. Our community housing sector hasn't built a lot of housing over the last 15 or 20 or 25 years. And so capacity needs to be grown there. There are limited resources at the city, so where can we try and have the most impact? And anyone who's worked on the federal provincial funding programs, those processes are very challenging. There is money out there, but they're very hard to follow. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what government's role in housing actually is, so we know who's who's supposed to take the lead. The federal government is not directly responsible for housing, but it definitely has most of the money. And they control institutions and areas of policy that affect housing. For example, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. It's a federal crown corporation, and they deliver federal housing initiatives. And the biggest one that's out there now is the National Housing Strategy, and they're governed by a National Housing Act. And then there's a group called OSFI, which people may not really hear much about, but it's the Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions. And they determine how financial institutions work, including how mortgage financing is structured. And so that impacts anybody who's wanting to buy a home. How the mortgage, what kind of mortgage coverage you have to have, what kind of ability to service the mortgage. They're setting those rules for financial institutions. The province has primary responsibility for housing, and they're covered under a variety of legislation. And they have the New Brunswick Housing Act. So most of the housing programs are under Housing New Brunswick. And they fund public housing, and they're building public housing, and they manage existing. They have various older programs. They have partnerships with the federal government in particular. And the province, a couple of years ago, put out a provincial housing strategy, and Housing New Brunswick is responsible for implementing that strategy. And there is some housing money through the Regional Development Corporation, but that's really focused on nonprofits and co-ops. And then there's municipal government. And historically, municipal governments in most provinces didn't have direct involvement in the development of housing. But now there's a very active role in municipalities across the country. Some had housing agencies in place, particularly in some of the bigger cities like Toronto and Vancouver. But east of Quebec, municipalities in Atlantic Canada have been a little slower coming into dealing with housing directly. But municipalities have a lot of influence, or can influence housing quite a bit through property taxes, what kind of standards we have, kind of zoning you have, what can you build on the land, kind of land use, how much can you build. So they have those abilities to really influence what neighborhoods look like, how much housing can be developed, and often how fast. And the federal government's recognized the role of municipalities as well, with some direct to municipal programs. One called the Rapid Housing Initiative, which was funded through municipalities, the Housing Accelerator Fund, which I'll talk about quite a bit in a few minutes, and a new one that's out called the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, which has money directed to municipalities for water and sewer, wastewater infrastructure to help speed up the development of housing. So it's good to know who's who in the zoo as we talk about who can do what in the housing world. So in 2021, the city did a housing needs assessment, and it discovered, working obviously with the province, that there were 1,500 households on the province of New Brunswick wait list for public housing, and that was 129% of the capacity that was available. So there was a real need for what's called deeply affordable housing units, the 30% of income. In July 2024, I got some additional information from Housing New Brunswick, and there are 2,300 households on the province of New Brunswick wait list for public housing here in Fredericton. And it's made up primarily of non-elderly singles and seniors. That's 1,400 of those 2,300 are identified as that. But the increase in the wait list is 53% increase. And it ties into what the province is saying on a provincial level, that the wait list has doubled across the province. And of those 2,300, 657 self-identified as homeless. But that does not mean homeless in terms of not having a place to sleep at night. But it was often people who are couch surfing, who are in housing that doesn't suit their needs. They don't have their own individual home. And then on shelters in 2021, at the time, there was about 250 on the by names list. I think it goes above 300 now. And trying to figure out in the study how much below market or lower end of market housing was out there with the private sector. They found that very, very challenging. The conclusion is likely there's not anywhere near as much of it as there ought to be. So from the needs assessment, an affordable housing strategy was created. Um, and it had a series of objectives. So it really called out the municipality to show leadership and create partnerships, and really to focus on this, what they call the third option, which is the community housing sector. And the reason we need to grow that sector is that's how you can confirm and be assured of long-term affordability because of the mandate of nonprofit and co-op housing providers. They are not for a profit motive. So if nonprofits and co-ops are owning and managing the housing, then it assures the long-term affordability. And that's really critical as we try and address the housing needs. But on the other hand, we we need market private developers to build, and they build most of the housing in the city. And so that needs to be a very, active market as well. We need to look at things from an affordability point of view, and reaffirming the mayor's task force on homelessness. This has become the Fredericton Affordable Housing Committee that Sandy was mentioned. It's a very active committee. It has a very wide-ranging group of individuals on it that bring their perspectives, everything from public health to housing operators to academics who have done the research to help support decisions. So it is a very active and robust committee, that's for sure. So out of the strategy, there were 7 top priorities, and the ones that are red are the ones that have been implemented. So it was to get some more capacity at the municipality, that'd be me, to look at the zoning bylaws, to try and speed up the development of housing. And so there's a big project underway now looking at that, to support community housing organizations, to provide municipal land for housing, to try and find federal and provincial support. Thinking back to the slide, the feds have all the money, provinces also have money, to be an advocate for affordable housing in the city, and to collaborate with other municipalities to learn best practices. There are lots of good things that are going on in other municipalities, and we work really closely with them. So to get some money, the city of Fredericton applied for what's called the Housing Accelerator Fund. And it was launched in March 2023, and it was $4 billion directly to municipalities. That sounds like a lot of money, but it really isn't. And 179 municipalities and territories received funding. So we were fortunate to receive, we were one of the 179 that received funding for about $10 million in 4 equal installments. But to put the 2.5 million a year in some context for folks, in 2024, we got $2.5 million. And at the end of October of this year, 10 months in, the city has $333 million in development activity. So that 2.5 million is less than 1% of that. And out of that 333 million, 123 of that is in residential construction. So our 2.5 million is less than 2% of what the city's overall activity is. So it was nice to get the money, but the development industry here is going gangbusters. So we've got to permit a number of units over 3 years. You can see on the slide. The federal government's very interested in what they call the missing middle. And that means anything more than a single family home up to a building that's 4 stories or less. There's a lot of focus on missing middle. Then there are buildings that are higher than 4 units, and then to look at housing affordability. And each of these different types of housing attracted a different amount of money. The housing affordability, we were able to define affordability in the way that best suits the city. So we have a mixed definition. We are looking to really help partner to build those deeply affordable units, but also to build those units that are below market as well, because there's a gap in that sector. So we're trying to encourage both kinds of housing. So to get our money, we had to promise 8 initiatives. And I'll talk a little bit in detail about these when we go along here, but just to give you the 8, one was rental housing programs. So that's incentives to nonprofits and private developers to build more rental housing. We have some programs under affordable home ownership. something called Neighborhoods of the Future, and that's really development on city-owned land. So the city has invested in infrastructure on DeMerchant Drive, which is up off Cliff Street. And if you go down Cuffman Street and then you go perpendicular to that, that's DeMerchant Drive, if you're familiar. And then there's the northern part of Cliff Street. There's a big development up there, a piece of land where the city owns it and has put services on that land. And those sites are being opened up for housing, both affordable housing with nonprofit providers and with the private sector. So it's a mixed income, mixed use type of place. We want to encourage modular and manufactured housing. And the reason we want to, it's not really any cheaper, but it's a lot faster. I saw a developer putting up a townhouse complex in early October. He'd gotten his building permit in September. The units were on the site in mid-October, and he hopes to have them up for sale. It's affordable ownership by early November. So it's really fast. And by the end of the year, those units should be sold and there'll be new homes. So it's quick more than anything else. The next slide, is that, and so there's work that's going on to look at the bylaw in particular, but we've got a program out. So we've already changed things for basement suites and garden homes, so backyard homes. Before, they could only be built in certain parts of the city unless you wanted to get comfort zoning, a zoning amendment. And now these can be built in any part of the city without a zoning, need to go through rezoning. There are requirements, of course, your backyard has to be big enough, and there are, obviously safety issues and all of that. Workforce housing, which is to put housing on commercial corridors near where the places of work are. And so that's up St. Mary's Street and then up around Bishop's Drive. And there's a grant to homeowners for $15,000 to help construct basement suites or garden homes. And it's the creation of a new rental unit. So in order to qualify for the money, you have to provide a copy of an executed lease so that there's a new rental unit. We're working closely with nonprofits to help grow capacity and to get some pre-construction costs. And while this one's not a real, exciting one, it's very important that we're, increasing a building inspection capability, because the longer you have a delay when someone's building for the inspector to get out, it costs more. And so the faster we can get out there, the better. And as well, having more automated processes. So it's not so paper driven that people don't have to come in all the time and bring everything. So we're investing in system changes. And then there's an initiative for the NBX lands, and the timing's confirmed to be confirmed on that because there's a joint decision-making process that has to work out. So the rental housing program, we've set it up in a couple of ways. Nonprofits always get more money than private developers. Because we didn't get as much money as we wanted from the accelerator fund, we can only fund 10 units out of a building. But there's a base, and then there are bonuses. So if you're going to build in the core, you're going to build in these places called growth nodes. And so those are Cliff Street, Brookside, and up by Bishop Drive. If you're going to build in those, there's a bonus. If you're going to build a bigger unit, because we really want to encourage bigger units. You remember from an earlier slide, it said that some of our housing is not meeting the current needs. And if you have an eye to accessibility and inclusion, so not just accessibility for people with physical disabilities, but inclusion for those with intellectual disabilities, there's a bonus that goes for that. So there'd be a maximum for a nonprofit of $400,000 and for a private developer for $300,000. We have some projects underway where we've committed to these projects. One building is half deeply affordable, half more market rent, or that lower end of market. And we have other developers who are putting a few units in their buildings. We have nonprofits who are going to be building rental housing as well. So we're seeing take up on the program. The next one is around affordable home ownership. If you want to switch the slide there, Cindy. So there's two components. There's a nonprofit program, and that's really to facilitate home ownership for low and moderate income households. So if you're a nonprofit developer and you provide ownership opportunities, and people would think of Habitat would be the first thing that would come to mind, Habitat for Humanity. If you're a community housing provider and they can leverage funding from the province and the federal government. We would provide up to $40,000 a unit to offset the capital costs of building a new project. We are in discussions with two nonprofits right now, one being Habitat. They've actually started work on their first units on that piece of city-owned land I talked about on Merchant Drive. So they're getting ready to do some work up there on their first, I think it's townhomes is what they're building first. And then just today at the Economic Vitality Committee, if you tuned in and listened, you want to take the next slide there, Sandy. We launched a program for first-time home buyers. Obviously, it goes to council for approval, but it was presented today at Economic Vitality and recommended to go forward. So if you were listening, you would have heard it. And it is for first-time home buyers. So there's a maximum income people can have. You can't have owned a home before. You have to be a resident here for more than 12 months. There's a maximum home size, and the reason that is to make it's not as costly to build. These will be located on city land. We'll sell the lots to qualified applicants for less than the market price. It'll be a competitive process, and then we'll choose people at random. And we'll launch it in 2025 in time for the 2025 building season. There are timelines on when you have to close on the sale, when you have to have a building permit, and when you have to finish your house. If someone can't meet those timelines, we would draw the next person who comes forward. We haven't decided on exactly how many of these units. We'll probably do a very small group to start and work the kinks out of the program. But this is an opportunity for folks to get into affordable home ownership. So as I mentioned before, infrastructure is key to open up land for affordable housing. Under Merchant Drive, it's with Habitat for Humanity is going to go in there. Probably, and Skee-Janelnog is going to build some townhouses, and Fredericton Nonprofit Housing Corporation is also looking to build rental housing there. And then there are still other lots available for sale, and they are for sale right now. So that street will probably yield at least 100 units of new housing, either through multi-unit or single-family homes. On Cliff Street North, that's about 8 or 10 acres of land. Depending on how it's built out, it would be, between 200 and 250 new units of housing that would go on there. We'd be looking for mixed income housing. Those are the most successful kind of developments. And that's it is best practice. So we'll be looking for that. We have some folks interested, but nothing's, been finalized yet. Obviously, working with nonprofits is really important. On the next slide, we have grants to promote capacity building for either existing nonprofits or new ones. To increase the supply of affordable housing. We have, there are groups who have received this grant funding and they're doing feasibility on whether it makes sense for them to actually develop and operate housing or whether it would make more sense to form partnerships. As I said before, it's very complicated to get the funding from multiple partners. And so this will help people get there. We have, I think, 5, maybe 6 groups now who've gotten capacity funding. And then we offer some pre-development cost grant funding as well that people can use to cover things like an environmental site assessment or geotechnical work or some preliminary drawings. And that helps to also determine whether your project is feasible. And so we're granting that. There are programs within the province, so we can stack ours with theirs so that people can expand the amount of money that's available. Anytime you can get a grant as a nonprofit, it helps reduce the cost to develop your housing. This is only for nonprofits. We don't fund the private sector for this kind of work. And as I mentioned, for modular housing, it's a bonus system. If you're going to build modular and you've been approved under another one of our initiatives, there's a bonus for that. And if you're just doing modular for without the half funding, then you can receive a bonus. We have committed 2 projects for this already. One is this townhouse development I mentioned to you. And so those townhouses will be for sale, but they'll be an affordable sale price compared to what's currently out there in the market. So what else are we doing? So that's our Housing Accelerator Fund money. We're working very hard on getting those programs out. So the next slide, in order also to support nonprofits, go to the next slide, Sandy. The city also has a separate grant program out of budgeted funds that will pay for building permits or development permits for the nonprofit groups that are building what I talked about, these deeply affordable units. And so rent at 30% of income, with the occupancy cost as defined by Housing New Brunswick, and tenant incomes also within Housing New Brunswick's requirements. So if you're a nonprofit and you're housing this type of your tenants fit into these categories, the city would cover your building permit, your plumbing permits, and any sort of other amendments you might have to make. This program was approved early on this year. We've had 2 groups already come forward to get grants for building permits. Council also voted last year, and I believe again for this year's budget, to have $500,000 a year for each of the next 4 years to purchase land for affordable housing. These are smaller lots that we would buy, and then we would invite nonprofits to develop housing on these lots. So they may be more, suitable for fourplexes or triplexes or something like that. Many housing programs, that's the right size to build. So we purchased 2 pieces of land already, and we would put those out to nonprofits probably in the new year. And if we have money out of other housing programs, we can stack them together to help make the construction of the housing on these sites more affordable. So the next slide. So what's coming is, we're hoping, is some cooperative housing into the city. The city signed an agreement with the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada to create a partnership and to grow the cooperative sector. And so there's a new co-op that's been developed to develop new housing units. It's a provincial co-op, and there is a potential for a 95 or 100 unit co-op in Fredericton as the first project for this co-op on city-owned land. They're working through the process to see the financing works. There's federal programming available and funding. So we're keeping our fingers very crossed that this project will go ahead, but they're in the early kind of due diligence phase. But it would be pretty exciting to bring a new co-op to the city. We have 1 co-op in the city, but it would be great to have a second one. And then my last slide, and I'll stop talking. So we try and raise awareness and do advocacy work. We're supporting the nonprofits. We have partnerships with all levels of government. We research best practices, and currently what's going on is we're going to update the housing needs assessment because it was last done in 2021. And we know the city has changed. Population growth has gone through the roof. I think it was 2023, we had 3,000 new people come live in the city. Our municipal plan anticipated 1,000 people would move into the city. So where are all those folks going to live? And so we may have, impacts on the affordable housing strategy once we see the results of that work in Q1. So that's what the city's up to in terms of housing programs and housing activity. We try and leverage other funding so that providers can maximize the number of units they can develop. And we really need to grow our nonprofit sector in order to get that long-term affordability. So that's it